Hi, thank you for joining us today for the 16th episode of Nima Voices, a virtual interview series. My name is Masumi Izumi. I'm a Japan-based scholar on Nikkei history. I teach at Doshisha University in Kyoto. I have been studying and writing about Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians with particular interest in issues related to the forced removal and incarceration during World War II. Now I'm involved in an international research collaboration project called Past Wrongs, Future Choices as a co-chair of the Archives Cluster. We are gathering information about the various experiences of the ethnic Japanese population in the Allied nations, such as the US, Canada, Brazil, and Australia. I have contributed a couple of articles for Discover Nikkei, and last year I was kindly interviewed by Discover Nikkei so that I could share my personal history as well as my research findings with the Nikkei community. Before we start the program, I'd like to briefly introduce the Discover Nikkei project and the Nima Voices series. Discover Nikkei is the Japanese American National Museum's international community-based web project with major funding from the Nippon Foundation, launched in 2005. The site is in 4 languages, English, Japanese, Spanish, and Portuguese, and shares unique Nikkei stories around the world from throughout the US, Brazil, Japan, Peru, Canada, Argentina, Mexico, and other countries around the world. New stories are published daily on the website, which is in the process of a major redesign and the addition of exciting new features. Nima are members of the Discover Nikkei online community. Hailing from all over the world, they each bring unique experiences and perspectives to the site's rich archive of stories. Nima Voices is an interview series where we uplift our Nimas through brief but enlightening interviews. In this 16th episode, I will be talking with Stan Kirk. Stan grew up in rural Alberta and graduated from the University of Calgary. He now lives in Ashia City, Japan, with his wife Masako and son Takayuki Dono. Presently, he teaches English at the Institute for Language and Culture at Konan University in Kobe, and he is researching and writing the life histories of Japanese Canadians who were exiled to Japan at the end of World War II. Stan began sharing some of these life histories on Discover Nikkei starting in April of 2018. 5 of these stories are now published on the site, with more planned in the future. After my conversation with Stan, I will ask him some of your questions. So use the chat feature to ask questions at any time, and I will go to a few of them at the end of the conversation. You will need to be logged in to use the chat feature. We will also be sharing links to the articles we mentioned in the chat. So now I would like to ask questions to Stan. First, could you tell us briefly about your background?
Yeah, sure. First of all, good morning, Masumi. It's good to see you again. And yeah, as you mentioned, I grew up in a small farming town on the Canadian prairies in the province of Alberta, which is in Western Canada, in a small town called Three Hills. It's about 100 kilometers northeast of Calgary. And I attended University of Victoria for my first year of university, and then moved back to Alberta and finished up at the University of Calgary. And then went to a graduate school briefly in the United States. I came to Japan for the first time in 1990 and have been here ever since, except for a year when I went back to Canada to finish my degree at the University of Calgary. And right now I'm working as an associate professor at Konan University in Kobe, where I teach mainly English for Science classes. And I also teach a global topics course, which incidentally, I teach the topic of the course is Japanese Canadians in Canadian society.
Why did you move to Japan?
Oh, that's a good question. I had just finished my first year graduate school in the States, and I kind of burned out, I think. And so I moved back to Vancouver, and I was teaching as a volunteer to immigrants in Vancouver. And I saw an advertisement one day for an English school in Japan. I thought, wow, I really need the international experience. I've been hoping for a chance to live abroad. I thought, okay, I'll go for 1 year. So I came initially as a Eikaiwa English conversation teacher, intending to stay for 1 year. But of course, as you can see, I ended up staying much longer.
I guess that's a common story among
Yes.
many of the English teachers here. Yeah,
Yeah,
great.
often
I'm
one
really
year
happy
for
you
me too.
stayed.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So did you have connections to the Japanese Canadian community growing up?
Actually, very few. I recall my mother having a few Japanese Canadian friends from her college days, and they visited the house a few times. But in the part of Alberta where we lived, I think there are very few Japanese Canadians compared to southern Alberta, like around Lethbridge, Medicine Hat area, where there were a lot of them were, right? So very few in our area. However, after I moved to Calgary, I got to know a few Japanese Canadians. And I remember in particular one very memorable lady. Her name was Lillian Kogawa, and she was one of the main office coordinators in the department at University of Calgary where I was teaching. And not only was she very competent at her job, she was just very helpful and kind to everybody. I think loved by everybody in our department. And I got to know her quite well. And one day she told me that she was a sister-in-law of Joy Kogawa, who wrote Obasan. And just like Joy's family, Lillian's family, and of course the Kogawa family all moved from British Columbia to Alberta, worked on sugar beet farms and so on. And then Lillian eventually married and moved to Calgary. So that's how I got to know her.
Wow, thank you for sharing that very special
Yeah.
story.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so now let me ask about your research. How did you first learn of the Japanese Canadian World War II exiles?
I'm almost embarrassed to tell you. It took me a long time to learn about it because I guess it actually started about 9 years ago when Konan University asked me to give a public lecture about some aspect of Canadian history or some aspect of Canadian culture. And at the time, I knew nothing almost about Japanese Canadian culture, so I thought this would be a good chance to learn about it. So I really had to start from ABC, just studying so I could prepare this lecture. And one of the many things I learned while preparing this lecture was that there were about 4,000 Japanese Canadians who had been sent to Japan at the end of the war by the Canadian government. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but that was just one aspect of the history. However, coincidentally, there were a couple of Japanese Canadians who I had previously gotten to know in Japan, and we sometimes went drinking together in Osaka. I always thought of them as just Japanese Canadians in Japan. But after I studied about this history, and especially about the 4,000 or so that had come back to Japan as exiles, I talked to these guys a little more, and I realized that they were exiles, Japanese Canadian exiles, and that really put a human face on the history for me. And I think my interest really deepened from that point.
So, can you give a brief explanation of the exile of Japanese Canadians during World War II for listeners unfamiliar with this history? Actually, the exile happened right after World War II.
Yeah.
How did this come about, and how many people were affected, and what happened to them after the war?
Yeah, well, actually, Masumi, this is your area of expertise, but I'm going to do my best. If I miss something here, please follow up and correct me. But to explain it very briefly, I think at some point during the war, the Canadian government gave the Japanese Canadians, most of them who were incarcerated in the internment camps at that time, a very difficult choice. Either move to Eastern Canada or move east of the Rockies, or accept a government-paid one-way trip back to Japan. I mean, one way, they couldn't come back. At the same time, they were prohibited from moving back to their homes on the West Coast. And also, the Canadian government had confiscated all of their property and had sold it off and used the money to finance the camps. And I think very little of that money ever came back to the original Japanese Canadian owners. So they'd lost everything. They were prohibited from returning to the West Coast, I think, until about 1949. And some of them were also very nervous about moving to Eastern Canada. They knew nothing about Eastern Canada. Many of them were fishermen, so they would have to learn a new job. And I think they're anxious that they would again suffer more discrimination in Eastern Canada. So I think about 10,000 of them, about half of them, made the difficult decision to go back to Japan. Another point I should have mentioned also is that during the war, they had lost contact with their relatives in Japan. And many of them were just really longing to know if their relatives were still surviving, if they were well, and so on. So those were some of the reasons. There were also other motives to go back to Japan. So as I said, about 10,000 of them signed up. However, when the war came to an end, they heard about some of the terrible living conditions in Japan at that time, and many of them changed their minds, and they asked for permission to reverse their decision to go back to Japan. And the Canadian government refused their request and said, no, you're going back. Eventually, I think Canadian public opinion turned against this kind of Canadian deportation policy, and the Canadian government stopped it. But by that time, almost 4,000 had already gone to Japan.
Right. Yeah, the Japanese Canadians had to go make a court case to have the right to rescind their repatriation or deportation the request. But yeah, it was a public opinion that forced the government to change the policy. Yeah, thank you. So what has been the most interesting aspect of this history for you?
That's really hard to say because it's all been very interesting, but I guess it's been very interesting for me to learn about the different kinds of situations and hardships that the exiles had to face and deal with after they got back to Japan, and also how they persevered in the midst of those hardships and found some way to deal with them and overcome, really difficult situations. And I think for me, perhaps one of the most interesting aspects is listening to these exiles tell about their childhood experiences growing up in post-war Japan. Some of the memories that they relate are extremely tragic and heartbreaking. Others are heartwarming. Some are, I would say, even humorous and inspiring, especially seeing how people helped each other. And sometimes, even though they were very badly treated by a lot of people in Japan, as they treated as foreigners, yet there were some others which I would call good Samaritans who unexpectedly reached out and helped them. And so I found that aspect especially interesting.
Mm-hmm. And which story that you've uncovered had stuck with you most?
Again, it's hard to think of one story. I think what stuck with me is some of the common themes that appeared in the interviews I held with them. I was quite surprised at how they had each of them had common memories of different aspects of their experience. For example, the decision to go to Japan, which I mentioned before, how they made the decision, and sometimes they disagreed. Sometimes relatives in Canada said, no, please don't go back to Japan, come to Toronto, and so on. But they made the decision to go anyway. Another common theme was the very difficult voyage back to Japan on the boat because of the rough seas. Many suffered severe seasickness. Other memories they told about seeing Fuji-san, the Mount Fuji, from the boat for the first time, and some of the ladies bursting into tears. And then again, I guess another example is the repatriation center at Uraga, where they were given inoculations and so on. And all of them seem to remember this terrible tasting food they were given and biscuits that were like dog biscuits that were too hard to eat almost. And then the next one was the very long and arduous train trip from the repatriation center in Uraga to their home villages. And of course, those old coal steam engines that were pulling the trains in those days. And they talked about smoke coming as the train would go through the tunnels. Smoke would come into the windows and people's faces would be blackened with the soot. Also, the situation was chaotic. People piling into the trains, people having to watch out for things, making sure things weren't stolen. Some of them remember beggars, emaciated beggars, approaching the train at every stop, begging for food, making them, just something you would never imagine could have happened in Japan. And I mean, the story goes on and on. Another one is perhaps the very difficult relationship often in the home village between the families, because the families, the Japanese families on the Japanese side, they were starving as well. They were in very difficult situations. They had soldiers coming back from the colonies after the war, which put a tremendous strain on the local village economy and the local food supplies. And then suddenly this big family from Canada shows up. And they've, of course, had good food, even though they were in the internment camps in Canada. At least they ate pretty well and they were in good health. And they looked almost like a different race because their appearance, the clothing was different and so on. So hearing all these different themes repeated by various people I interviewed, I just found extremely fascinating. And maybe that's, for me, that's perhaps one of the most interesting parts of my research.
Thank you. Yeah. So how do you, as a Canadian, relate to the history you're researching on a personal level? Could you share your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I think this really has changed how I view things as a Canadian. I've come to realize how lucky I was to grow up in an era of stability. I knew nothing of war. War was something of the past. We always had enough to eat and so on. And so in one sense, I feel very lucky even now. I realize, wow, those of us who were born into that kind of situation are so fortunate. I mean, we can't even start to imagine what it's like for the Japanese Canadians who were interned, and then especially for those who were exiled, and were suffering hunger and all kinds of hardships in Japan. I can't even start to imagine what it must have been like for them. So that's one thing that I think is kind of weighed heavily on my mind. Another thing that's more recent is a kind of growing anxiety I feel as I see, even on social media, for example, some attitudes being shown towards ethnic minorities in Canada that really are not so different from some of the attitudes that were present against the Japanese Canadians or Chinese Canadians, around the time of the war. And it gives me a sense of anxiety, wondering, what's going to happen. Are we going to move that direction as a country, or are we going to move back towards a more liberal, democratic society that's accepting of, accepts and welcomes diversity?
Right. So you have been interviewing Japanese Canadians who were exiled, and some are still living in Japan. So how do you select the interviewees?
Actually, it's not a case of me selecting them, but so far it's been a case of me just being fortunate enough to meet some of these people. The first exile I interviewed, his name is Mikio Ibuki, attended my lecture about Japanese Canadians, and he kindly approached me at the end of it and introduced himself. And I remember him saying to me, "Thank you for telling my story." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I was born in Canada, and I was one of the exiles. I came to Japan when I was, 7 or 8 years old." And then he came to my office the next day with boxes of pictures and articles and things like that. And I realized I was onto something really good. So that was the start. But again, he introduced himself to me, and he became my first research subject. And then a few months later, a friend introduced me to another Japanese Canadian exile who had actually moved back to Canada. His name was Masumi Izumi, and he lives in Vancouver. And so I researched Basil. And then Basil, in turn, introduced me to his 3 sisters who live in Osaka. They never went back to Canada after they stayed in Japan all their lives as well. So a lot of it has just been through good luck, finding people who are willing to be interviewed and wish to, share their stories for posterity. So I've been very fortunate, I think. And so I don't really select people. I welcome anybody who is willing to tell their story.
Yeah, actually, and there are so few of them left now that it's actually
Yes,
more challenging to
that's right.
find them. Yeah, so I really appreciate this opportunity for me to get to know these people through your research. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So why do you use the term exile instead of deportation?
Hmm. This is a question I think that I'm often asked. When I first saw the word exile, it struck me as kind of a strange term to use, and I guess finding a term that adequately describes the situation of the Japanese Canadians who were sent back to Japan is quite difficult. I think the Canadian government used the word repatriation, which is kind of a propaganda, I think, because as I've heard other people point out, most of the people who were sent to Japan, many of them were either naturalized Canadian citizens. Many of them had never been born in Japan. They were born in Canada. They had never been to Japan. How can you repatriate someone to a country they'd never been to before, right? They were Canadians. How do you repatriate? It doesn't make sense. The term is just nonsense. But the Canadian government used that term quite effectively as propaganda at the time. The other term, which you just mentioned, is deportation, which I think is closer. On the one hand, deportation is a little bit problematic too, because they weren't forced at gunpoint to get onto a boat and go kicked out of the country, right? Although they were kind of, I think many of them did go against their will. But deportation also has the idea, it's not something you do to your own citizens, right? You deport a person from another country who you want to send back out of your country, back to their original country. So again, for the same reason as repatriation, deportation is problematic. You cannot deport a Canadian citizen and call it deportation. So I think in recent years, the term exile has come to be used, and it's not really completely adequate either, but it does include the nuance of kind of being unwillingly separated from the country. And many of these people were unwillingly separated. I mean, they were shedding tears as the boat left Vancouver, right, and went under what's now called Lionsgate Bridge, I think. But anyway, the term exile does include that nuance and wish to return to the country. So it's not a perfect term, but it's become sort of generally accepted. And although now there are some people who still don't find that term acceptable, I was interviewing one exile, and he went to Japan when he was like 2 years old, and he had a very good experience. He only has good memories of his village in Japan. And he said to me very clearly, he says, we were not exiles. I want you to call us Kika, which I think means returnees, right? So even among Japanese Canadians, I don't think there's complete agreement on the terminology, but I think exile is probably the term in English that comes closest to being adequate.
Okay, and you have written some of these stories in Discover Nikkei, and why is it important to you to share these stories through Discover Nikkei?
Well, I was very lucky to be introduced to Discover Nikkei by a Japanese Canadian guy named Normi Buki several years ago. And so I guess one of the reasons why I like publishing Discover Nikkei is because the editorial staff is always so welcoming and so helpful. They would do anything for people who are contributing stories and so on. I also like the type of media that Discover Nikkei is. It's not super academic. It's really kind of on one level a grassroots public history type media, where it's a meeting of people from all kinds of walks of life. It ranges from university professors to just people who like to collect stories, storytellers, artists, and so on. So it has that very nice kind of public grassroots feeling to it. But it's also very useful. The kind of data that they collect, I think, is very useful for academic people as source material for academic people. I think another aspect of Discover Nikkei that I really appreciate and admire is the fact that it's so international. I think, for the last 50 years, my impression is that in Canada, for example, the Japanese Canadians are becoming self-aware over the last 50 years or so, and developing their own literature and talking more about their own history. Now, in the last couple of years, I think there's more of an interest in diaspora communities in other countries, such as not only the US, but Brazil, Peru, Australia, and so on. And I think Discover Nikkei is really playing a very important role in this because, it's published in 4 languages and it's read by all the diaspora communities. So I can read about, and also the articles are translated into the various languages. So I can read something from a writer in Brazil and so on. So I think Discover Nikkei, this breadth and this way they connect the diaspora of the various countries is really contributing to the sort of growing awareness that these diaspora have of each other, this growing awareness, or this growing interest that the diaspora communities in different countries are developing towards each other.
Thank you. Yes. So now we would like to take some questions from the audience. If you haven't already, please post your questions for Stan in the chat. And I think I already have one question from Conrad and Marilyn Weave. So the question is, has there been any compensation, either financially or through some formal apology from the Canadian government to those Japanese Canadians who were exiled or deported?
I don't think there's been maybe Masumi, you can correct me on this, but as far as I know, there hasn't been.
There has been redress, and the people who were
all of them, right?
Yes, including the people who were deported who stayed in Japan.
Yeah, okay. But that was the same redress as the Japanese Canadians in Canada received, right?
Yes, at the same time. So
it wasn't a special separate.
Right. So I don't know if the American government compensated people who left America and stayed in Japan, but Canadian government, they actually tracked people down in Japan and did compensate. Yeah.
Yes. And that was not a special compensation. That was the same compensation that the Canadian government to all Japanese Canadians for the incarceration and so on. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Are there other questions? Is that it? Okay, so I think it's time for rapid fire questions. Okay, so first one, who is your Nikkei hero?
I don't have one. I can think of 2 off the top of my head. Their names are Joy Kogawa and Tatsuo Kage. Both of them have been very active as social activists in the Japanese Canadian community. And of course, Joy is also an author. Both of them have personally been very supportive of my research. And Joy is an interesting character. I sometimes say I can't agree with all her opinions, but you can't help but loving her. She's one of the kindest, most opinionated, but also one of the kindest people I've ever met. And I always enjoy when I have a chance to talk with her. Tatsuo Kage is someone who I am deeply indebted to. He was the pioneer researcher in this area that I'm researching now. And Masumi mentioned about the Canadian government looking up the exiles in Japan so they could give them compensation for what happened during and after the war. And actually, he was the leader. Tatsuo Kage was the leader of the delegation that came to Japan to help find these people and explain the terms of the redress payment and so on. And he took because he was the pioneer researcher in my area of research, I got to know him quite well. And unfortunately, he passed away about a year or so ago. I really missed the great conversations I used to have with him in his home in Vancouver.
Okay, on a different note, what is your favorite Japanese food?
Actually, everything. I think my answer to that question will depend on what day you talk to me or what day you ask me. Everything. I like of course, the sushi, but I like the yakizakana, the roasted fish dishes, all the vegetables, natto, all those dishes that are considered really Japanese dishes. They agree with my stomach and my taste buds very well. I think if you would ask me today, I would have to say, I'd like to mention one vegetable. It's called it's a Japanese root vegetable called renkon. And it's a very tasty, it's probably my favorite vegetable. It has got a very nice feel when you chew it. And no matter how you cook it, it absorbs various kinds of flavors very well. So no matter how it's prepared, it's very tasty. And so I guess I could say that's my favorite.
Okay, and quickly, what's the Japanese value that most influenced you?
I guess it would be the tendency towards mutual support. I saw that in my research when I saw how Japanese Canadians were suffering both in the camps and after those who were exiled were suffering in their villages, but yet people came to the rescue sometimes and they helped each other. And even in my research group, I tend to be a very individualistic kind of a researcher. I like to sit by myself in the corner and do my own thing. But having joined some research groups now, I've been quite impressed how Japanese researchers put their heads together and cooperate and really accomplish some really interesting stuff together. So mutual cooperation, mutual support, I guess, would be the value.
Thank you. So please check Stan's stories on Discover Nikkei, which you can find in the live chat. So do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share, Stan?
I want to just again say how much I appreciate Discover Nikkei and the support that it's provided to me and to many others. And also, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Masumi. You've been a great supporter of my research and collaborator for years now. I could never have done without you. And you also introduced me to some of the research groups I've joined. So that's really been great for me. And I better not start naming names, but I've just, received so much help from people at the Nikkei Center, the staff there, various places. Again, the group that Masumi and I are both members of, Past Wrongs, Future Choices. I've had a chance recently to meet some of the scholars and some of the leaders of that group. And I just feel very fortunate to be included in that kind of a collaborative research and very grateful.
Yeah, it's been really wonderful working with you too, and I've been you've been so diligent publishing your stories, and I'm kind of slow in writing. So yeah,
I'm writing stories. You're writing books, so it takes a little longer.
Yeah, thank you. So please keep it up. Yes. So this concludes today's Nima Voices interview. And don't worry, Discover Nikkei has many more virtual programs planned for 2024. So up next is a virtual poetry reading on August 22nd, moderated by Tracy Kato Kiriyama, yay, with poets featured on Discover Nikkei's monthly Nikkei Uncovered poetry column. The next episode of Nima Voices will be in November with Graciela Nakachi in Peru. She'll be interviewed in Spanish by guest host Enrique Higa. Please check their website regularly, sign up for their email list, or follow them on social media to find out about these upcoming programs and more. In addition to Discover Nikkei's virtual programs, they have recently opened submissions for their annual Nikkei Chronicles writing project. They invite you to share your stories about Nikkei names to be included in this special series. Visit the link being shared on the chat to learn more. And finally, Discover Nikkei would love to hear from you. Contact them at editor@discovernikkei.org with your feedback and suggestions for future episodes and programs. Thank you again, Stan, and thank you everyone for tuning in.